Hi, folks. Welcome to a thrilling new episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. I'm here joined with Richie Christian, who's a consultant helping companies deliver better, more compliant medical devices, thanks to his expertise in developing compliant AI/ML medical devices. Richie, welcome to the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Pleasure to be here.
Of course. So, Richie, you have a rich experience in medical device space, and you recently turned to more of this field that is the data management piece, specifically for AI and ML models. Can you tell us why you decided to join this specific field within medical devices?
Yeah, I would say I stumbled upon it, to be honest. It's not something that I pursued, but as my career started in hardware medical devices, with and without software, then I transitioned to software as a medical device with a lot of emphasis on AI and ML. And then, of course, AI ML data management is super important for AI ML. So it's been a transition to just in terms of it's how I ended up here. I wouldn't say data management is something that I actively pursue doing, but it's so important for AI ML systems that it's become a reality in the quality regulatory space currently.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely become important. Can you tell us why it's become such an importance for AI medical devices?
Yeah, basically, regulators know that devices that are powered by AI systems, the data is really the fuel that's driving all of that. And they realize that data is super important for device performance. So, of course, regulators care about device performance. It's their brief to protect public health. So they care about device performance. And because data is a significant driver of performance in these systems. That's one reason. The other reason is data is also a huge source of bias when it comes to these systems, and biased systems can produce prejudiced results. And that's something regulators, of course, care about. They want devices to perform equally on all subgroups of the population. And that's why data is becoming quite important. And if I look at the data management material that we have currently in the medical device space, so it's 4 years ago when the FDA published their good machine learning practices in October of 2021. This is a 2-page document outlining 10 principles people need to think about when they're developing AI-based medical devices. And 5 of these 10 principles touch upon data management aspects. So you can see half of the 10 in a 2-page document, quite prominent. Fast forward to where we are now. In January of this year, the FDA published guidance document on AI lifecycle management. And this is a 65 plus page document, and data management covers 7 pages approximately of this guidance document. So you can see that over the last sort of 3-4 years, the amount of guidance that we've gotten from regulators has increased quite a bit. And so the key thing here is because data is important for these AI ML systems, regulators are now providing a lot more guidance, and they're expecting a lot more manufacturers in terms of data management.
You talk about performance. I think it's very important to highlight this. How is the data contributing to the performance? And can you give us an example of a situation in which data enables performance?
For sure, it comes down to the intended use of your device, right? When you want your device to be used in certain patient groups or in certain conditions under certain environments, basically the data you have should support that intended use. And so if you imagine you're only targeting the elderly patient population, for example, you need to make sure that your data has enough of that population to be able to perform in that population. So it comes down to what's your intended use and what data do you need to achieve that intended use. It could also come down to things like, if you're working with imaging devices, what kinds of equipment that your device is going to work with. So it's a lot more that goes beneath the surface in terms of device performance. But at a high level, you consider your intended use, and then you drill it down into the specifics.
Of how the data that you have to get in order to serve your population for that specific use. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk more get into this topic a bit more. And some of the acronyms that I've heard are not necessarily clear, I think, for a lot of people. I'm talking about, for instance, GMLP, so Good Machine Learning Practices. Can you tell us the history of that? Why has it come into play? What's its evolution right now?
Yes, for sure. So GMLPs are good machine learning practices in the medical device or the life sciences space. We have our GXP acronym. So we have GCP for good clinical practices, GDP for good documentation practices, and a lot of good practices. So GMLPs are essentially good machine learning practices. These are 10 principles. This is the founding document that started all of this, published by the FDA back in 2021. These 10 principles that talk about how these systems should be developed. And if you imagine 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have the standards that we have, didn't have the guidance documents that we have. So this is the latest and greatest at that time. And in terms of its evolution currently, a lot of other regulators have adopted these good machine learning practices. So in the medical device space, we have the IMDRF, another big acronym, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And earlier this year, they finalized these 10 good machine learning principles for regulators around the world to adopt into their own regulations. If you look at the European side, for example, there is the German Notified Body Alliance. It's an independent group, so it's not an official European Commission group, MDCG, but they published a questionnaire on AI. So when you're preparing your technical file, for example, for an AI, what kinds of things do you need to have? And in this questionnaire, there is a section on data management, unsurprisingly. And this particular questionnaire drills into a lot more granularity for data management. So it lists 38 questions on data management. So do you have this in your document? Have you thought about annotation? What were the credentials of the annotators? And it goes into a lot more detail. So you can imagine we started off with very brief principles in GMLPs, but now a few years later, we've got much more guidance. And then there's also work being done on the international standardization front. So ISO and IEC has a joint technical committee on AI, and they're making a lot of standards, and they've published quite a few standards in this space in the last couple of years. So we're seeing more adoption of GMLPs into standard way of implementing these into operation.
Yeah, I think it's good news for medical device manufacturers to be able to follow one general principle instead of many different ones. So it's maturing and it's moving in the positive direction. I want to understand, if you're a company right now and you're developing an AI medical device, how do you integrate these principles into what you're currently doing? Do you do it at the beginning, in the middle? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the appetite companies have on taking risks, essentially. And in this case, regulatory risk or risks to delays in certifications. So, I think each company has their own appetite on what they're willing to take on to reach their goals. But ultimately, a pragmatic way to do this is to understand the space from a regulatory point of view and see what's available out there. And the key thing that I always recommend to the clients that we work with and their quality regulatory folk, especially, is to understand what processes do you currently have. Even if you have a small startup, they usually know how they currently manage data, or they have ideas of how they want to manage data. So it's looking at your internal workflows and internal tooling and then internal processes, and then trying to map them or bridge the gaps with what standards and guidelines are asking. So that's what my recommendation is to clients, is to not rush and put band-aid solutions to just get through this submission or to get through this audit finding, but plan for the long run. Essentially, data management is a life cycle process, and you're going to need data management for as long as you're going to be using data for AI ML in your medical devices. So the key thing is to look at data management holistically and then implement processes that make sense for your context. For a 10-person company with one device, that looks very different to a company with 7, 8, 10 medical devices versus a large multinational. So looking at your appetite and then going from there.
Hmm. That makes sense. And when you say thinking of the long term, right, of security, it's more and more something that's coming up, and it's not necessarily something that we're seeing right now, but it's getting more and more important in a similar way. And when you say mapping out and doing things in the long term, thinking about different points of the data and within the cycle, how does this process integrate with cybersecurity? Is this something you've already heard medical device manufacturers and regulators talk about within this piece of the data security?
Yeah, I think data security features quite prominently in these guidelines because data is so critical for these systems. It's imperative that data is secured. So there are definitely expectations from these regulatory guidelines that you think about data security and you protect your data throughout the data life cycle, from the time you gather your data, from the time you store your data to archiving your data, you make sure that security is also considered front and center of this whole process. And even threat models, that's a topic you talk about a lot on this channel, that threat models would also consider security of data. And the FDA guidance document, for example, on AI lifecycle, it talks about all these attacks in terms of data poisoning or model evasion and model inversions. And certainly the bar is quite high in terms of data security from regulators.
Ooh, tell me more about that. The bias is quite strong for data security.
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, I want to hear more about that last point that you said about the more scrutiny from the regulators on this. How have you seen this manifest within projects you've been working on?
Yeah, for sure. They're expecting these evidence within the risk management file or within the threat models. So I think as regulators are putting out more guidance, there is going to be this increased expectations on what manufacturers have to provide to prove to the regulators that you've thought about data security in addition to security for your device as a whole.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Because from my experience, Richie, a lot of the focus historically has been put on integrity of the medical device. So is the medical device capable of delivering its function? And back in the past, you wouldn't have all this data need, right? You just have a simple program or maybe a bit more complex of a program that would take an input and do an output. And now we have all these layers of complexity in data, which is gaining more uncertainty and more potential angles of attack. When we talk about data security, what are some of the risks that are not really taken into consideration that medical device manufacturers should have a deeper look into?
I think it's, like you said, it's not something that teams are focused on. They're focused on performance quite a bit. And then they're focused on safety, of course, because traditionally that has been the two main factors: safety, performance. And of course, they are important. But when we have these data-driven systems, it essentially creates this new area that companies now have to place an equal, more or less, emphasis on these areas. So data security, we talk about data management, and these are relatively new when we talk about these concepts in the medical device space. We've had clinical evaluations for a long time, for example. We've had ISO 14971 based risk management processes for many years now. So these are processes and concepts that people are familiar with. Post-market surveillance, people are familiar with post-market surveillance, but when it comes to data management, data security, these are relatively new concepts. And I think that's catching out companies who are not familiar with these concepts, and they're trying to now understand a lot of guidelines around this and implement it at the same time.
Yeah, more and more. And I think regulators are pushing onto something that you say to increase the transparency between the users and the manufacturers of medical device, and also with regulators. And they're asking for transparency. Can you tell us what transparency means in AI medical device context?
Yeah, I guess transparency is basically making information about your data and your AI models and its performance, its characteristics known to the relevant stakeholders that need to know. So, of course, a stakeholder that's important in this context are your users, right? So you have your healthcare professionals who are going to be using it. They need to know about your device and the data. Regulators also need to know about your device, and here they need to know about your device so they can do a proper scientific and regulatory review of your device to assess that your device is safe and it performs. So I think you need to identify the stakeholders, and then you need to disseminate this information in a way that is suitable to your audience. For example, the FDA requests that you provide characteristics of your testing data and your training data in your 510K summaries, for example, and you go to the recent 510K summaries of AI-powered SAMDs, you could see that manufacturers are putting a lot more information about this in terms of what was the testing data, what were the characteristics, what was the distribution, and all of that. The way you can disclose this is, of course, we talked about 510K summaries. This is a public-facing document that anybody can read, but also in your user manuals, right, for your users. Essentially, have a section in your user manual about data transparency. What was your training data like? And there maybe you can disclose a bit more because I guess you have a closed group of users. So you're not disclosing to your competitors. One other method sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just saying the competitors can buy the medical device, no? In most cases.
Yeah. And I think that's where
And
manufacturers have to balance privacy, IP considerations while being transparent. So it is a tightrope to walk, but the goal is to make your users aware so they can really assess for themselves whether they're going to receive the outcomes that they want from your system. And ultimately, it helps build trust towards the AI system. So that's the key thing here, is building trust in AI systems.
Yeah, and I think trust goes a long way in medical sector in general, because it's not just about commercially, you're going to be able to sell more, you're going to be more, you have a better brand, but also if the patient believes more in the treatment that they're going to get, they're more likely to follow the other prescriptions of the doctor. And overall, your medical device is just going to have more benefits, even though it delivers some performance, because people trust it better. And perhaps it plays more with the placebo aspect, but I don't think any of us are medical experts. But I think, yeah, it goes a long way. I want to go back to something that you said. I read that you were working on. It's design history file debt is something you've shared about. How does that play out? Can you tell us what it is?
Yeah. Design history file debt is essentially, in an ideal world, you would design, develop, and document as you go, essentially. But the reality is quite different. You would normally have development that's more or less happened, especially this is common with smaller companies who are completely unaware of the regulatory realities. And so there, what you're doing is you're creating debt, essentially things you need to now retroactively fix or document. So debt is a generic term, right? It could be in software development, it could be with usability, it could be with risk management, it could be with data management, for example. It's basically doing lifecycle activities without following proper procedures that are compliant to regulatory guidelines and then documenting it. So there you are knowingly or unknowingly sometimes creating debt that you need to address later on. So when we talk about debt in data management, a common thing that you might want to submit in your submission is a data management plan, for example, right? And maybe your team never thought about writing a data management plan, but now you need it, but the development has been done, right? So what do you do? So that's a debt. You need to still create your data management plan. But in an ideal world, you would create your data management plan much earlier in your development life cycle. So it really drives all of the data management activities rather than writing a document at the end, which doesn't really serve a purpose in that sense.
So it's like that in general. A little bit is fine, but don't let it get over your head.
Yeah, exactly. I think mature teams will know where to draw that line and how far to go.
Mm-hmm.
without making a huge problem out of DHF debt. Because you can imagine if this continues in multiple areas of the QMS for months and months, you're just creating so much more work that needs to be done at the end. So I think there is a balance. You can strategically create debt, but you need to know where to draw that line. And usually mature teams, experienced people know where to draw that line and how to catch up essentially without waiting right until the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's absolutely important. And I think there's many things in medical devices that are like this, where you wait until you document, and you at the end, then you're like, oh, I have to do this. And I think security also follows a similar process, where if you don't start implementing or thinking about how you do it later, you'll have a lack of it later. The security that is for sure another concept that we can for sure explore. But one concept we've mentioned in other episodes, but not yet on this one, is the idea of security risk management. So in the specific case of AI-based medical devices, what does it look like? What are some best practices we've been seeing on this kind of activity?
On security management?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you would essentially, in your security management process, you will also need to make sure that your AI and ML models are also within the scope of your security risk management activities, essentially. So that's the initial step. You need to figure out what's the scope of the security risk management work that we're going to do in this project, for example. So there you would make sure that all of the AI related aspects are included in the scope of your risk management activities for security. And then when you do your risk analysis, when you do your security, when you do your threat models, for example, you will know that those assets are also something you need to consider as far as security goes. So I think it requires acknowledgement quite early on that this is under scope and this is something you need to treat like you would any other asset within your system.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's another layer of management that we have to do as medical device manufacturers.
Yeah, I think the challenge is integrating these parallel processes into something that gives you a desired outcome at the right time. So I think that's the key thing, having your risk management system talk to your security system, and then having your AI security risk assessment as part of that based on what the FDA is asking, for example. It's tying all of these dots together while you're doing the development. I think that's the real challenge here.
It's like having your head both down at your books, but also thinking about later and
Exactly.
strategically about
Yeah.
doing both. I mean, we don't want to be alarming here, but what if we have poor data management standards? Can that affect device performance and perhaps as well as cybersecurity? Can we draw a parallel between these two?
Definitely device performance. The regulators will definitely act as a gate here. I'm hoping these kinds of systems are not getting on the market. But you can imagine if there's some system where the labeling was done poorly, for example. So data labeling is the key part of your data management. If that's done poorly, that's directly going to affect your device performance. So I think
Data level, just want to confirm, data labeling is about telling about which one is more sensitive or which one is more. Can you tell
it's
us how it is done?
it's
What it looks like?
associating truth to your data. It's essentially saying this
Ooh,
particular
okay.
image is cancer. It has no cancer. So
Mm,
whatever, it could be a diagnostic thing, for example. So somebody needs to, like, supervised learning. Somebody needs to label the data and say, okay, this is cancerous or this is not, for example. So you can imagine something like that could heavily influence device performance.
oh yeah. Oh yeah, and security too, right? Do you know about cybersecurity? Do you have an opinion on this, or if poor data management could influence cybersecurity?
I think it's probably the other way around. Poor security could affect data management. For example, if you have poor security practices, for example, you have insecurity of data storage, for example. Now you open the door for a whole bunch of problems with your data, for example. So I think I see it as poor security influencing management of data.
I think it's definitely right. There's definitely security involving management, but as well management itself of the security. Management should incorporate also a layer of security, because if you allow anyone to have access to anything, imagine you're part of a larger organization and you allow your whole organization to access everything on one specific file. Your management is creating security vulnerabilities that could be open. So it's really in a whole
Exactly.
circle.
Yeah. And I think, something like that should be included in a data management plan, for example. Where is the data going to be stored? Who needs to have access to this data? And then it's something that you review on a life cycle kind of way, right? You make sure that nobody has elevated privileges that they don't need to have. So I think it's definitely a key area and something that I think should be covered in a data management plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so too. And I think it requires a bit of collaboration between different teams of an organization. Have you ever seen conflict arise from data management
I wouldn't say any
in organizations?
personnel conflict. I think sometimes teams tend to work in silo.
Hey folks, Matt here from the editing side of the video. The recording didn't go as planned, but don't worry, you didn't miss too much of the conversation. But if you want to find out more about what Richie does, I've attached the link of his LinkedIn to the description. So if you want to reach out to him, feel free to do it there. It's Richie Christian. Now, where was I? Yes, here are my top 3 learnings for this episode. Number 1, data is the new core of regulatory compliance for AI and ML medical devices. Why is that? Well, AI-driven medical devices depend on data for the device behavior, right? And this affects performance. It obviously matters. Now, from the FDA, we had the initial good machine learning practices, which we described as GMLP, to the 2024 AI lifecycle guidance. There's been a big increase in scrutiny on data quality, representativeness, and governance. So this is something that we have to make sure that we follow. What does this mean for manufacturers? You need to proactively define data management practices, including data sourcing, curation, and labeling, ensuring diversity and coverage align with the device's intended use. Always start with the intended use. Ongoing lifecycle monitoring of data fidelity and bias. If your device changes over the course of its lifetime, which it inevitably will, make sure that your data management practices follow. Number 2, cybersecurity and data management must be integrated from day one. It's nothing surprising. We've been talking about it for some time. AI introduces new attack surfaces. So we have data poisoning, model inversion, and data, unlike static code, is vulnerable before, during, and after development. So how can you protect all of this? The best practices for cybersecurity is be sure to include AI ML risk assessments in your threat models. Threat modeling is essential to understand what your threats are, and integrating this early will save you so much hassle later on. We also want to address access control. Who accesses what kind of information? We want to ensure that the storage has protections and secure annotations workflow. We know where it's going, we know how it's going, and we control everything from an organizational point of view. And then from this, we can entire lifecycle monitoring, so version control, provenance tracking. So it's not just about cybersecurity, it's also about making sure that you're working properly. So if you have poor cybersecurity, it creates new vulnerabilities. There's 2 sides of the same coins. And number 3, strategic alignment and documentation are non-negligible. Many teams, especially startups, focus on building the product first and struggle to document later. This creates design history file debt that we talked about, which if it's missing or misaligned regulatory documentation, that can delay or derail approvals altogether. Because if you don't have the right documentation, and therefore authorities expect a well-defined data management plan, traceable integration and quality performance, security and risk. Here's what you can do instead. You can align internal processes with regulatory framework from the start. Build documentation in parallel with your development. As you do the thing, do the documentation for it at the same time. and avoid band-aid compliance, which is when you try to do something towards the end and that usually fails under audits, and your auditor will notice that they're trained to look for this kind of thing. So what about us? Next week we'll have our last episode for the season. I hope you're excited. In this episode, I'll share all that I've learned about medical devices throughout the 17 episode, I believe, maybe 18, that we've had. It's been a thrilling ride, and I want to share my knowledge, synthesize it for you, give my impression. So it's just going to be me on this episode. I hope you're excited for it, and I'll see you very soon.